The Middle East has an intoxicating history. It's a cradle of civilizations and a beautiful, complicated land that's home to some of the world's most hospitable people. Jerusalem, Beirut and Cairo. The Middle East cities read like a roll call of historical heavyweights. In this land of historical, architectural and all manner of other treasures, it may just be the people who'll live longest in your memory, along with the privilege of exploring such a fascinating land. This is one of the Middle East's most treasured attractions, and when the sun sets over the honeycombed landscape of tombs, it's a hard-hearted visitor who is left unaffected by its magic. Towering over both the urban sprawl of Cairo and the desert plains beyond, the pyramids of Giza and the Sphinx are at the top of every traveller's itinerary. The Middle East may be strewn with landmarks left by the ancients, but few carry the raw, emotional power of Persepolis. Sacred to Muslims, Jews and Christians alike, the Dome of the Rock is an epicentre of religious convergence and conflict. It is also home to a gold-plated mosque of singular beauty, built to represent humankind's yearning for God. The Nile is Egypt's lifeline, an artery that feeds the entire country from south to north. Only by boat can you appreciate its importance, and also enjoy seeing archaeological sites from the water. From ruined cities to the aspirational architecture of the great faiths and modern settlements whose origins date back to the dawn of time, the Middle East is an astonishing and complex region where the past is always present, history is the heart and soul.
Conceived in Paris and London during the dark days of World War I, and drawn initially with a crude chinagraph pencil, the secret plan to redesign the Middle East was termed as the Asia Minor Agreement, with vast areas under British and French influence. France had colonial ambitions, while Britain wanted to protect the Suez Canal and connections to its most important colony, India. The Sykes-Picot Agreement was named after Sir Mark Sykes, representing the British government, and François-Georges Picot, his French counterpart. It's a quote attributed to Sykes that showed the ambition as well as the folly of the task ahead. I should like to draw a line from the E in Acre to the last K in Kirkuk. Both Sykes and Picot were quintessential empire men, seasoned in colonial administration. They were believers in the notion that the region would be better off under European control. As the future spoils of the Great War were debated by Britain and France, vast areas of the Ottoman Empire were argued over. Picot was determined to secure control of Syria for France. For his part, Sykes raised British demands to balance out influence in the region. But among British concerns in redrawing the Middle East were the apparent promises made via a British colonel named T.E. Lawrence, better known as Lawrence of Arabia. He galvanized a Bedouin army against the dying Ottoman Empire, hoping that full Arab independence would be the prize for Arab loyalty. The Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916 killed those ideas. The areas that had been under Ottoman rule since the early 16th century ended up creating new countries and two spheres of influence. The Syrian coast and much of modern-day Lebanon went to France. Britain would take direct control over central and southern Mesopotamia, including Baghdad and Basra. Palestine would have an international administration. Sykes-Picot has been seen as a flawed arrangement. The arbitrary drawing of borders became the hallmark of imperialism. But this was an agreement laid down before the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, before Russia withdrew from the First World War. It didn't account for the emergence of Turkey, nor did it allow for the future growth of Arab nationalism. But it was the beginning of what we know now as the modern Middle East, for good or for bad. 100 years on, the borders of Sykes-Picot remain debated and highly controversial. Francis Collings, The Newsmakers.
When you think Palestine, you may think violence, land sieges, and a decades-long Israeli occupation. But what you might not know is that another country played a driving role in causing the region's conflict: Imperial Britain. From 1516 to at least 1917, Palestine was under the control of the Ottoman Empire, a religiously diverse land where Christians, Muslims, and Jews lived alongside one another at peace for the most part. Then in the early 1900s, a small number of European Jews were trying to drum up support for Zionism and the establishment of a Jewish homeland. Just 20 years before, in 1897, the movement led by Theodor Herzl was initiated at a conference in Switzerland. They decided that they would advocate for a Jewish homeland in Palestine, but the movement at the time didn't have much support. And at the time, only around 8% of the population of Palestine was Jewish. At the same time, Arab nationalism was on the rise and many Palestinians wanted an independent state. Imperial Britain knew of both the ambitions of Zionists and Palestinians and used the situation to bolster their own interests. In 1914, amid World War I, Britain went to war with the Ottoman Empire. And in 1915, Henry McMahon, Britain's representative in Cairo, approached Arab leaders with a proposal. Britain would agree to Arab independence if they helped fight against the Ottomans. Then in 1917, Britain's Foreign Secretary wrote a one-paragraph letter to Walter Rothschild, a leading figure in the British Jewish community. It read, "His Majesty's government views with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object." The letter became known as the Balfour Declaration, and it was in stark contrast to a declaration of the British and French armies in 1918, which assured the people of Syria, Palestine and Mesopotamia of autonomy. So what was going on? Britain had promised independence to the Arabs that lived in Palestine, but then also promised a homeland for Jews on land that was already inhabited. Was Britain just transferring land that did not belong to them to whoever they liked? When the Ottoman Empire collapsed in 1918, the League of Nations gave Britain a mandate to administrative control of Palestine in 1920. It was a dual mandate. On one hand, they were to act on behalf of Palestinians, but on the other hand, they were to act on behalf of the international community of Jews who wanted to establish a homeland. Britain then drew up arbitrary borders, transferring the eastern bank of the Jordan River to the Hashemites. It was under the British mandate that Jews from Europe began to immigrate to Palestine and buy up land. The Jewish population in Palestine grew tenfold from 60,000 to more than 600,000 between 1918 and 1947. Many Palestinians saw the mass influx of Jews as a European colonial movement. So, as one might expect, it led to conflict. In 1929, riots broke out at the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem. Both Palestinians and Jews lost lives. In 1936, after Jewish immigration increased even more riots broke out. This time, the British were heavy-handed and killed between 2,000 and 5,000 Palestinians. A Royal British Commission concluded that because Britain had allowed mass immigration, Palestine had two distinct societies that couldn't be reconciled. They recommended a partition of the land. The Arab Higher Committee rejected this, saying it was all their land. Britain then banned the Arab Higher Commission. They introduced the White Paper of 1939. It stated that Palestine should be a binational state inhabited by Jews and Palestinians, but that Jewish immigration would be limited for 5 years. But illegal immigration still went on, and violence continued to erupt. And when Britain couldn't handle the mess they had a part in creating, they handed the country back to the UN in 1948. the UN then decided to partition Palestine. The story gets a lot more complicated after this. But the British promising land which already belonged to Palestinians to other people has played a part in decades of conflict and bloodshed.
On a December day in 2010, a produce vendor in Tunisia stood in front of a government office and set himself on fire, killing himself. His desperate actions helped spark a revolutionary uprising that has come to be known as the Arab Spring. While the uprising across the Middle East and North Africa did not take place during a specific calendar season, they were commonly referred to as the Arab Spring, in allusion to the so-called Prague Spring, a 1968 democratic revolution in Czechoslovakia. The Arab Spring timeline began in Tunisia, a country that had been under the allegedly corrupt and authoritarian rule of President Zain al-Abidine Ben Ali for more than 2 decades. On December 17, 2010, a working-class vendor named Mohamed Bouazizi was approached by Tunisian authorities about his unlicensed cart. He offered to pay a fine, but instead his vegetables were confiscated, and he was publicly humiliated by the police. Afterwards, to add insult to injury, local officials refused to hear his complaints of harassment. In a show of protest, Bouazizi stood in front of the local governor's office and set himself on fire. He died from his injuries on January 4th. Bouazizi became a martyr who inspired others who were suffering from unemployment at the hands of a corrupt government. His death sparked a Tunisian revolution in which protesters armed themselves not only with signs, but with cell phones, allowing the protest to spread at social media speed. On January 11th, a week after Bouazizi's death, Tunisia's government fell apart, and the disgraced president Ben Ali fled the country. The videos of the successful uprising shared via social media raised global awareness of the protests themselves. State-run news organizations were barely able to keep up. The speed and success of the protest inspired others across the region. Throughout January, protests erupted in Algeria, Jordan, and Oman. By January 25th, the movement reached Egypt, followed by Syria, Yemen, Iraq, Libya, and several other countries. On February 11th, Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak stepped down, and by the end of the year, Yemen's government was overthrown, as was Libya's, ending the dictatorship and the life of their leader, Muammar Gaddafi, who was captured and killed by Libyan rebel militia. While some of the Arab Spring protests did result in regime changes, not all of them brought about positive change for the working-class people like Mohamed Bouazizi. In some cases, the uprisings were co-opted by religious extremists like ISIS, who embraced the revolt against secular Arab regimes for their own agenda. As a result, when governments toppled in places like Syria and Iraq, rebel groups stepped in to fill the void, using strong-arm tactics and even terrorism. In Syria, civil war has resulted in the deaths of some 500,000 people, stoking the fires of unrest. Along with political instability and economic stagnation in neighboring countries, the Syrian civil war has also led to a massive refugee crisis in the region. While the Arab Spring revealed how fast a revolution fueled by technology could unfold, it also once again proved how complicated and unpredictable revolutions can be.